Hi, and welcome to the Biotensegrity Tea Party. We're so happy to see you here and delighted that this is the first of our series on the ecological perspective. So our guests today are Damian, Kelty-Stephen, and Madhur Mangalam, and they're going to be speaking on ecological psychology and how whole body multifractal tensegritic synergies support cognition. But first, let me tell you about the Biotensegrity Tea Party, which is a all nonprofit production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive. I'm Chris Morita Clancy, coming to you from Coast Salish territory, just outside of Vancouver, BC. And I'm here with my co-host, Susan Lowell de Solorzano. Hi, Susan.
Hey, everyone.
And Graham Scarr.
Hello, I'm coming from sunny Nottingham in the UK.
And why don't we begin, as always, with a toast? I believe that Damian is going to do our toast today.
Thank you for welcoming us here, and I look forward to the chat.
Cheers.
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 Okay, why don't I pass the mic to you, Susan, and you can get the ball rolling.
Yeah, maybe if you'll spotlight the three of us.
Okay, and then we'll also ask our Zoom audience at this point to please turn off your mics and your cameras for now. Okay.
I want to save plenty of time for the Q&A, but I want to also make sure that we get a few, kind of basic questions in. I want to start with you, Damian, but I want to ask you and Madhur both the same questions so that everybody has two answers to the same questions. And so my first question is, what is ecological psychology? How did you find it and why did you choose it?
Do you want to go first, Madhur?
Yeah.
You first, you started ecology.
Okay. No. Okay. Ecological psychology is an attempt to sort of start explaining more of behavior in terms of nesting relationships rather than sort of in terms of specific parts that might be nested. So much of cognitive psych and information processing approaches to psych in general will appeal to the brain or appeal to some sort of abstract capacity for inference and computation. And I think we definitely have those abilities of inference and computation, but I think that we have given those parts and those abilities a primacy that they maybe don't deserve. And so rather than trying to look into one or particular component or another and see what does it do, and then make us sort of the ongoing challenge of explaining where that ever came from, rather than sort of putting all the intelligence there, looking to see how much intelligence is distributed across nesting relationships, cell within tissue, tissue within organ, organ within system, organism within environment. So that, and I got to it by accident. I think I was going to graduate school at University of Connecticut. I found a cognitively oriented psychologist interested in dynamical systems, interested in sort of how we sort of can change our mind and how we sort of get our computer processes out of one mode and into another, because once computers are doing something, it's very rare for them to get out. And so I applied to work with this person. He had some very interesting questions. Jay Dixon is his name. He still has some very interesting questions. He's still with us. He's doing great stuff. And I got there, and one of the first things he said was, you want to look at what CESPA is doing, and that was sort of another division within the same department. He was in the developmental division, and so he said, you should check out what these people over in CESPA are doing, and that's the Center for Ecological Study of Perception and Action. He said they're doing some interesting stuff. They try to do psychology without using memory as an explanation, and I said that sounds like crazy talk. And so I thought, that's I can't do that. And then I read a bunch of stuff about what they were doing. And then I sort of I was converted, and then I switched over. I kept the same major advisor, but I switched over, and then now Jay Dixon he switched over shortly afterwards. He's now their director, and so so we got on board after being baffled at how anyone could do this. So yeah, so that's my story.
And this is at the University of Connecticut.
Yes, University of Connecticut.
Yeah, that's great. Okay.
Madhur?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I think ecological psychology is more a science of interactions than a science of representations. And if you look at our methods and our explanations, we are mostly looking for interactions. It can be nested interactions, interactions with the environment, organism-organism interactions. Even in the brain and behavior, what we are modeling is interactions rather than representations. So it's a big leap from constructivist cognitive theories. And how I was exposed to that again, stochastic. I was a PhD student at University of Georgia, and my advisor Dorothy Fregesi, she gave me a book to read called "Encountering the World" by Edward Reed, and then references from there into Gibson. And she asked me to, which she couldn't by then, and she always wanted to attend the ecological psychology meeting, the ICEP meeting. And it was in Minnesota. It was my first academic conference of that stature. And the whole group, I was like, I used to attend classes when I liked the professor, even though I didn't like the subject. So for me, the likability of the person was very important to do anything.
Yes.
And that conference had some of the best people I know. And it felt like a home. And I think I never moved off from there.
That's great. So you mentioned Gibson, Madhur, and so now I have to ask you, Gibson, who's Gibson? Just because I know a lot of people who watching may be introduced to this name for the first time here.
So Gibson was a psychologist at Cornell in 50s and 60s, in 70s, as well as in 80s. And he was a contrarian in his thinking about vision mostly. A lot of his work was on vision, especially early work. And at the same time, there were, when you look at MIT and other places, a lot of good work was happening in vision from a very constructive standpoint, where, this is what your eyes do, this is the feature which has been extracted. It adds up to these things, and, the whole additive and modularity of the mind, a lot of work was being done in cognitive science in terms of the modularity of the mind, which later on turned into, a lot of, books from Harvard, an MIT cluster. And Gibson found that was perhaps not true. And there was other way to think about vision and perception, more from the standpoint of optic flow, which was, much earlier. I think he was able to see that how the organism was nested in an environment more clearly, or at least he was able to formulate it better than anybody at that moment, which was not very well accepted at that point, especially by the more, I mean, it still not is by the more prominent standpoint. But Gibson was very prolific, and he made very compelling arguments, which some people picked up really well. And now we are at a place where ecological psychology has substantial footing and evidence, in its favor.
And another name that that I learned when I was starting to look into this field is Bernstein. And I wonder if one of you could maybe just.
I just had a 1 hour lecture on Bernstein, but
Okay,
I
go
skip on that.
ahead.
But Damian would talk about that, yeah.
Oh, okay. I actually I wanted to just peg something on top of the eloquent things that Madhur said about Gibson, all of
Yes.
which were true. One thing that I think that it's constructive to think of Gibson as a counterpoint to Helmholtz, who was sort of this 19th century genius who knew a lot of, was a polymath and laid the groundwork for much of the work we do in many sciences. And but Helmholtz took this perspective that light was disorganized, and we absorbed these photons, or we didn't know that they were photons, but he understood light is coming in as a sort of these individual local signs of stimulation on the retina, and it was the job of the body and the brain to sort of organize that. It was like our retinas were colanders that sort of pulled all this structure out and sort of had and then Gibson basically, I think, turned that on his head and said sort of on the order of, you don't have to organize all this light. The light and the world and the stimulation is already organized. So like, you just can lean into it. So that's another way to sort of encapsulate the historical context here. As for Bernstein, he was a movement scientist working in the Soviet Union. I'm unclear on. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So Bernstein was a scholar working in the Soviet Union contemporaneous with Pavlov. And he was Jewish. And so he was undermined and underrepresented as a consequence of cultural bias. But he had a radically different approach to the concept of a reflex and the idea of what the motor system was and how to understand it. And so, whereas Pavlov thought of it as something of a machine, we had these muscles that were innervated, and you could sort of press these reflex buttons and get these reliable responses. Bernstein was pointing out that actually what was called the reflex was not just sort of a thin strand of nervous tissue through the spine. It was actually a full-bodied affair that was very context sensitive and actually variable. So he was looking at some of the early neurophysiological data and could sort of he understood that the paths were not as well beaten as Pavlov said they were. And so he sort of understood that there was a lot of context sensitivity. You could change one tiny aspect of the task that didn't always, but it could lead to radical qualitative wholesale reshiftings of how the body did things. So whereas Pavlov sort of promoted this idea, which is now very popular, that the body is like a puppet that the brain is puppeteer for, Bernstein was sort of the idea that the body you couldn't understand any aspect of the movement system except in the context of this whole organism form, shape, and its intentions, and it's the way it's situated, nested in the task context. And so that the role of nesting in context sort of made Bernstein a nice fit with the ecological ideas. And so that's why when you went to the colloquium room at University of Connecticut, where the ecological group would meet, there was a picture of Bernstein and a picture of Gibson right next to each other. And so it was embedded in us that we had to sort of keep both of these people and their ideas in mind at the same time. So, yeah.
And when I think of Bernstein, I also think of many-to-one mapping. Tell me if I'm wrong on this.
No.
There were these experiments with a guy with a hammer, and instead of the body doing the same thing, although the hammer's hitting the same spot each time, unlike a machine where you would want it to be very precisely, every piece precisely tuned for precision, the body's doing almost the opposite, would you say, Madhur?
So yeah, that's the Bernstein's, degrees of freedom problem, that how is it that infinite degrees of freedom with infinite ability to produce that variable movement still can produce a repeatable endpoint, So Bernstein was interested in hammering movements, for instance. A person can produce the same kind of force with a hammer by having, a trajectory which is never repeatable. So the question is that what exactly is the movement system trying to control, and how is it trying to control? And that still remains an open question, at all levels, starting from neurophysiology to neuromuscular to musculoskeletal.
So Pavlov sort of promoted this idea, and sort of it's a very powerful way to understand the nervous system and the movement system and all that stuff, as sort of like it's a set of individual tissues composed and completely understood in terms of their component cells and those cells' abilities. And so that's a very high dimension. So it basically makes any task, any ability that we can describe in a few words, actually, at our sort of task cognitive level. We can describe that very simply, but actually, in order to understand that, according to the Pavlov framework, which remains dominant, that's a very high dimensional math problem. You have to somehow squeeze all these numbers into a very small, that they have to add up to a very simple statement. Bernstein, I think, and it's sort of, he wrote some poetic things that are hard to parse sometimes, but I think what he was after was, he was starting to take a multi-scaled lens on the movement system and tried to understand it not just in terms of sort of the sum of all these individual parts, but in terms of its hierarchical form, where you could see it act and control at multiple different levels. And the levels they lived together necessarily. It's the same body, the same task environment, all this stuff, but control was able to run up and down the different levels and could operate differently. And so one way to misunderstand Bernstein, according to Mark Latache, he's the one who's pointing out the misunderstanding, is that you have all these parts and you need to figure out how to fit all of them together into differential equations. Rather, I think what Mark Latache has said the Bernstein problem is better understood as is this issue of how you cross levels of a multi-scaled organism, multi-scaled system, where you have control that can operate at the space of the joints in a different way, obviously related way, but at a different way from the level of individual motor neurons and stuff. And so somehow these priorities and these abilities have to get translated from language to language, presumably. I mean, so if you look also at Skinner's work, he sort of will point out, when he was doing his work with learning, that like it was really impossible to sort of start shoving cognitive mental states in behind these operationalizations of learning. And he said, it's a different language. And he took this as sort of like permission to say, we're not doing it. It's silly. Bernstein, I feel, and Mark Latache seems to be picking up on this. Like Bernstein was saying, like, this is the challenge, and somehow the movement system is pulling it off, and we have the choice whether we want to actually address how that works.
So I'd like to add that, just like for Gibson, there's already a mainstream view of cognition. Likewise, for Bernstein, there's actually a mainstream view of movement, which still remains the dominant view, where we look at like open chain kinematics and try to model joint angle trajectories, for instance, and see. And it turns out that a lot of things when we look at that, we are not able to see. Okay, so my talk was, for example, showing that how we can get a much better understanding of disease and disability and the cascading effects of disabilities. And Damian is also, we are working together on some work related to that. We can see only from a Bernsteinian perspective, which is not very visible from a perspective of simple joint angles, which kind of add together to create these open chain kinematic chains, which are very, very additive systems. So I think Bernstein was very visionary when he did not formulate it in the same language, but he recognized multiplicativity better than anybody in the movement science, at that particular time.
So not additive systems.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It's kind of like,
really, to a third grader.
Sure. Well, so I think one way that I enjoy seeing, like, reaching in and to our sort of more standard psychological trainings and awareness out there, sort of like the idea of like the whole is different from the sum of its parts. This is a Gestalt psychology saying, and it's basically, I mean, they were like proto-ecological psychologists, and they stumbled for reason. There are some logical inconsistencies within their framework, but what they were trying to point out is like, oh, the world is actually structure. And so they were, many of them, physicists who were sort of interested in field-like structure. And they were sort of noticing that, oh, you have all these atoms and you have all these particles, and they all sort of do their own thing and sludge off to, a disordered mess. But there's also these capacities for nature, for the world, to be organized at long spans of space and time. And that's sort of how physics can work. And like, we can unpack why it works. It's not just like magic, but there are cases when the global activity of a physical system is not discernible from just adding together all of the individual atoms and molecules and their individual motions. Like there's coordination at different scales, sort of like there's coordination for Bernstein at the task level that you might not see at the individual motor neuron level. And so this idea of the whole being different from some of the parts means that like you can have, and so we have like the classic psych textbook cases, like you have the phrase "the cat," and you have the tops of the letters cut off, and so it's not, the words aren't there, but still we have the impression of seeing it. Or you could have, you know, these like Pac-Man faces pointed towards each other, so it looks like they're talking to each other, and people can see the triangle. And not everyone does see the triangle. There are plenty of folks who don't have all the same higher order experiences. But there are a lot of these times when you know, so anytime we get a suggestive interpretation based on facts that are incomplete. So it's like hearing the tail end of a sentence. You can guess sort of based on your read of the culture and the society and the group that you're talking with. You could probably fill in some of the gaps. And that's I think an intuitive way of thinking about how it's not just the sum of its part. If it were, you wouldn't get it. If it were, you'd be sort of stuck. And then all of speech is actually a mess. And we can't sum that up. So we'd never really get to it.
I mean, the whole co-articulation process, you know, our speech apparatus is a multiplicative apparatus. It's non-additive, and how we transition, you know, from, you know, vowels, and, you know, how we actually create these words and sentences. It's an emergent multiplicative process. Cannot be added together.
So, another way that Michael Turvey liked to point out, like this fact in like plainer terms than like mathy stuff, was like he would point out that we have all these, you know, so the computer metaphor for the mind is very strong, very clear, very useful. But if you look at other aspects of the body or the behaviors, like he assigned this wonderful paper once about how they don't have a good metaphor for muscle. And muscle can act like a spring. It can act like a strut. It can absorb. It can release. It can do all this stuff. Like, and he would assign this right next to papers on Bernstein, where he would point out, like, you can even map out all the different muscles and bones, but the same the same muscle will act as adductor or abductor depending on posture, depending on task. So like you can. So like that's a case of the task level and the posture, the sort of whole body posture level feeding down and changing effectively the identity of the item, and or at least what it can do for anything else. So it's sort of the individual parts, they change based on pressures that exist beyond any sort of scale where you're defining what that item is.
I would love to know which paper that is. If you think of it,
which the one about the metaphors for muscle or the metaphor?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I have that one somewhere. I think
it's a book chapter, right?
There should be lots of book chapters on that. This was a paper in Nature, I think. It was a multi-author, like, what do we do, kind of call to arms, or just sort of moping. I don't know which, but it was, I'm pretty sure it was a review article in Nature or Science, one of those. But there should be chapters on this, so that's fine.
And this basically, you know, so then the lecture I gave, you know, one of the questions was that if everything is connected, then why can't we study parts of it, because parts should be representative of the whole connection? That's actually not true, because parts take up roles based on what the whole entity is doing or the context. So given the nesting of those parts, studying those parts actually is not very informative when we're talking about a system.
So now we're getting into the concept of synergies and soft assembly. Would you say?
Yeah. I think that there are times when you can learn like the interactivity does give you something because you're seeing shadows of the other activity. But so this idea of like you can measure one part and see the whole thing. Like there are a class of physical systems for which that's true. But then as you get more and more heterogeneous structure within them, then you're just going to miss more. But you can. I mean, I think when we say like all these different structures matter, I think there's not we're not actually asking for everyone to stop until we can measure everything and say everything about everything. So like, I think I mean, so I would counter or compliment saying like, you can start to see traces of this if you do try to look anywhere. And that's sort of where some of my work started. So like I've started looking at these single observables, and you can see traces of this, and then you can sort of take the veil back and look at a bigger lens on the whole system, which is kind of what Madhur and I have been working on.
So this is what I was asked, like, are you trying to say that we need to study everything?
Yeah.
And by that, of course, I mean, we need to study everything. I mean, ultimately, a best model is the one which has everything. But when Damian says that we can see signatures of that in parts, we can see signatures of these in parts which actually based on statistics. So when we do, for instance, multifactorial statistics, what we are trying to find is the signature of that interactivity in those individual parts. And then we can look for those interactions as well. Mm-hmm. So there's no end to when the system is complete, but there's always a beginning which is better than the previous beginning.
There we go. So, okay, now, what does all this have to do with biotensegrity? Ecological psychology was an established field before the connection with biotensegrity was made. Why? Can you help us understand, what it is about biotensegrity? Although I think this conversation has already, pointed to why biotensegrity, why people in ecological psychology are early adopters.
So from my perspective, this is ecological psychology is I think it's evolving in a way that I think more traditional psych is not. And I think it's fun. I think there's some missing spots, some spots we haven't done as well as we could. But I think that one big challenge, and Madhur and David and I have written something that we're hoping we'll get into a handbook on ecological psychology on this point, is like one tough pain point in ecological psychology. We talk about nesting, and then sometimes very often ecological psychologists will sort of say, oh, there's all this nested stuff out there, but then they sort of don't want to talk about what happens to nesting once you get to the skin. Or what does it mean? So you have the organism in the environment, and then so like, we're very antsy. I'm more puzzled by the antsiness than feeling antsy myself, but many of us are very antsy about Helmholtz and his interest in physiology and what he did with physiology. And so I think when you ask ecological psychologists about memory or about learning, you're asking questions about something getting inside the organism, and they don't do that. Many of them don't do that, don't want to talk about it. You have information that is detected by the organism and is not detected by any suborganism structure. And so this has been like a tussle where we want to maintain the function, the role of the task level. And I think it's been an ongoing struggle as to sort of like, well, what ways can you think about the organism that wouldn't be cheating and that wouldn't be giving up the interest in nesting? And so tensegrity first came on my radar from Turvey, talking about how we had all this interesting variability and nesting sort of beyond. And then he started talking about how within the mechanics of the movement system, and this was like presumably the thing that Gibson and folks like him weren't talking about, because they were talking about the organism and they weren't getting into the interior of the body and how things move. But the Bernsteinian way of doing movement requires some sort of nesting of motor degrees of freedom within things like synergies. And so then when you look at, and so like one reason that you can sort of see a promise for that is because there's all this nested structure. You sort of have things like fractal scaling, where you have, like for instance, on the surface of the lungs, you have infinite alveolar surface area, or unbounded because of all that internal structure. And so the movement system is like that too, broadly construed. And so Turvik was very interested in sort of seeing how like nesting can actually unfold within the body, and that might be part of how many of these parts are working together, serving task goals, serving organism priorities. And so it sort of became an honest way to talk about movement that wasn't just going to commit to a sort of a tinker toy view of, you know, hip bone connected to the leg bone sort of thing. And so it became and then sort of it raised a lot of questions for like, okay, so can we talk about movement? Can we talk about the interior of the body as a place where some of these experiences and these coordinations are happening? And that's, I think, an ongoing controversy right now. Madhur,
And
did you want?
just so people know, when we talk about this, could you clarify the concept of self-assembly and the use of the word synergies?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because synergies is being used in a very specific way by you guys.
Sure.
Can I add? So synergy is actually a very abused term.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on who you're talking to. For instance, if you're talking about a person in stroke rehabilitation, they will say synergy is bad, because when you see stroke, basically, you know, people are not able to move digits independently. They call it a bad synergy, right? A synergy. When you talk Mark Latash, right? Mark Latash has a book called Synergy, which is a very different take on synergy. Compared to, for instance, when you talk to neurophysiologists, for them, synergy is basically neurophysiological mapping, where you have multiple, you know, co-articulatory ability of the brain. Okay, they call that a synergy, right? So it depends on who you're talking to. But it is deeply related to the tensegrity or biotensegrity idea. So the traditional neuroscience or cognition has a brain-body divide. So you have a brain, which is a very different formalism compared to the body. And then you have traditional biomechanics, which has a body, which has a very different functionality than the brain. I think one of the attractiveness to biotensegrity to ecological psychology is that it has a structure which bridges that divide, and a lot of control can be embodied in that closed chain kinematics, which some kind of neural tuning can manage. Okay, so then there's not a homunculus, basically, you know, in the sense, you don't need to explicitly involve feedback loops. A lot of things are just diffused in how things are, and self-assembly is kind of built in any closed kinematic chain kind of idea, in a nested, you know, closed kinematic chain idea, which is also physiologically, by the way, when we think of these models, we think of like stale, you know, models which remain the same, but physiology is like always churning out and changing and things, right? So this cross-scale things allow room for growth and adaptability, which a fixed system does not.
So I would add, sort of following on my earlier comments about Helmholtz versus Gibson, sort of one thought you had to organize the light, and the other said, well, the light's already organized. I think Helmholtz would have said, yeah, okay, so you need to organize the light, and you do that with the brain that organizes these messy, otherwise passive, inert body parts. And this is a way. So tensegrity for me and some ecological psychologists, I think, becomes sort of a way to see how it's already organized. Like, so the response to local perturbation and local stimulation could be global, like for free. It's already, you don't have to like gather up these loose parts that weren't summed together just before the stimulation. And now it's an acknowledgement of pre-existing poise, pre-stress, and just the ability to then sort of, it suggests something about the setting of the body as it leans into a structured world. So for me, it balanced the books in terms of like structured world out there, but I never really liked this. And sometimes you'll hear this in the ecological psychology land. The information is out there, and it's like that means like all the structures out there. And then, but it's, for me, that perspective risked making the whole body a black box, and the whole body a homunculus type thing that needed explanation, that was just opaque to analysis. And so tensegrity sort of is a way to say, okay, so the nestings are there, they continue, and you can see more of a balance between nested structure without without wherever the boundaries are. You don't have to have a boundary necessarily. The boundary could be functionally movable, depending on what your analysis is.
Great. You were talking about the mind-body separation, Madhur, and some of you might know I have an education background. I was surprised and delighted when I was listening to an interview with you, Damian, and you started talking about John Dewey. And I thought, John Dewey? Is that a different John Dewey? Could that be the same John Dewey? So the historical, the sort of antecedents to this inheritance, as Dewey put it, of the mind-body problem, right? Or the artificial mind-body separation, is something else you're looking at. And I think it relates as well to this idea that in ecological psychology, you're saying there is no central executive. There's no little man sitting inside the brain pulling all the levers and turning all the wheels.
I would say there's the, but yeah, so I would generally agree. I would say there is the capacity for executive control distributed across multiple different parts of a fluid system. So I think when people say there's no no central executive, people are like, whoa, we just lost like goal-directed behavior then. It's like, I think goals happen. I think tissues are steered by goals, tissues wield goals. And I think then, especially when you start looking at swarms of organisms having intelligence built at larger scales than just the individual organism, I think there's a valid way to talk about executive functions migrating and swelling to meet bigger or contracting these smaller circumstances. And Dewey, I think, was ahead of his time. I think basically I see my work like cleaning up the details and just sort of dotting his I's and crossing his T's, because he was already in 1896 able to see that the reflex arc idea was impoverished in ways that we hadn't even fully fleshed out the poverty of the stimulus, and the poverty of the reflex arc was like if you see one thing as impoverished, you're going to give us the other. So if you see the stimulus as impoverished, then you're probably going to see, oh, we need this reflex, and that's going to be this passive thing that's going to serve this like executive inference engine somewhere. Dewey saw that was nonsense. He saw that basically you needed something more. It's a very poetic paper that he wrote about the reflex arc. It's hard to tell what he wants. He wants not an arc of that sort of that's broken. He wants something that sort of coils outwards into the future. And so it sounds to me like swirls and eddies. And that's when I sort of feel like, okay, we need some way to talk about turbulent structure that is implicit in what he was talking about without him having that language or that skill set.
And before you jump in, Madhur, just let me say, Chris has the link to, that's the link I sent you, Chris, was that John Dewey paper.
Okay.
And maybe you could pop that in the chat if you get a chance.
You sent it.
I sent it on
Email?
WhatsApp.
WhatsApp. I'll check, but I didn't.
All right. Sorry. Thanks. Go ahead, Madhur.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, yes, there's a neurophysiological evidence of spinal loops and the spinocortical loops, spinocerebral loops. But one can still argue, come back with an argument, when does a reflex become a non-reflex, at what scale? Like, how much mush do we need between like two neurons? Is it like one interneuron or two interneurons or like 3, 5? When does a reflex become a non-reflex? So, I mean, all these, all these kind of artificial divides, we have created for the ease of, communication, probably more than anything else.
So I think we've got a good idea of where you guys are coming from. And Damian, you're you're a psychology professor. But Madhur, you're a biomechanics professor. What the heck is ecological psychology doing in biomechanics, and what is Biotensegrity doing in biomechanics?
Well, for me, I think Damian has a more consistent, uh, loyalty to the discipline, in this respect, in psychology. So my training is also in psychology. I'm a PhD in psychology, general psychology. I started as a biology student, but what happens is that you just read and learn what you like, and then you do a work of certain kind, and these are all coincidences. So when I was interested in human movement, biomechanics was the department interested in human movements. The other such departments are mostly in kinesiology and a few psychology departments. So that's why I'm in biomechanics. Uh, and and yeah, and biotensecurity actually, I was introduced to biotensecurity by Michael Turvey's 2014 article in General Motor Behavior. And it took me weeks and weeks. I read it again and again and again. Because it's a pretty intense article, and I was a first year PhD, at that time. And before that, I used to work on monkeys. I was still working on monkeys, by the way, at that time. So it was a big leap, but there was so much into that. The article was so challenging, at that stage, that it kind of devolved a hold of me. So that's how, biotensicity ended up shaping my thought process since then. Damian, go ahead.
Great. I want to give our the rest of the people joining us here chances to ask questions and make comments and such. Before I do that, anything you'd like to add before we take it over to the Q&A? We're good?
No, I appreciate the questions. I feel like I've gotten to say some of the things that I enjoy being able to share. So thank you.
All right. So then I'm going to invite people to, if you could possibly do the raise hands thing, that it use that Zoom function where it might say react, and you can do it there. That just pops it up in a nice organized list. And then if you want to come on and ask a question, and maybe we'll start with Steve. We're going to start with your comments. And also you can turn your cameras on when you're, if you're going to be joining the conversation. Steve, I'm going to spotlight you. I think. There we go.
Well, hi everyone. I've been at this now for just about 50 years, and this has been the most exciting discussion I've heard on biotensegrity and its interrelationship with the body, because this is what I envisioned 50 years ago. And in 1980, my first article came out saying from viruses to vertebrates. And it was the virus of vertebrates, the systems and subsystems. And this is what I've been talking about. I never thought the brain was separate from the rest of the body. And, to me, it all fitted together. Tensegrities are oscillators, so information is transmitted physically and through oscillations and through all sorts of other ways. And to me, this was, an integrated system, and I finally see that it got into somebody's head and is working with it. And so I'm really excited by what I just heard today.
And
thank
I
you so
should
much.
Thank
also
you.
ask, Damian, Madhur, do you have any questions of us, of Steve, of the Biotensegrity community?
I mean,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I have read almost every article written by, Professor Levin. In fact, we were in touch during my PhD before we stopped. So yeah. I gave actually a talk based on his article at one of the conferences, Society for Comparative and Integrative Biology. Extremely excited about, talking about snakes and birds and, reptiles and humans with the same lens. there were like 2 people there, my talk. So I came back a little disappointed, and then things continued. But our work basically strengthened both the spirit and in the evidence. But yeah, so I've been inspired by Professor Levin's article throughout.
Well, thank you
Yeah,
so
no,
much.
I don't have questions. I just came here hoping to learn more. So that, and I remembered the talk that Professor Levin gave at the place I did grad school, and it was just an illuminating talk. It got me reading lots of things that I never considered before. So thank you for having us on. This is a nice reconnecting of an arc
Hey, I'd
into a
love to
cycle.
drive up to New Paltz. It's a nice drive from here. And I used to spend time up at Kingston.
Oh yeah.
Right, yeah, so I know the area pretty well.
What were you doing in Kingston, Steve?
Actually, I was a counselor in camp
Mm.
up there.
Oh, that's great. Well, we don't have any hands up in the chat. David, maybe you could come on. I'm sure you've got some thoughts to share. Or maybe not. We might not be there. Sorry,
There he is.
I'm
put
here.
you on the spot.
Yeah, so I guess this is a question maybe a little more so for the Biotensegrity community, but I've chatted about this a little bit with Susan, so I thought I would just maybe put it out for everyone for any thoughts or comments. There was a period where I was reading quite a lot of somatic psychology.
David, you got to tell everybody, just give them an overview of who you are and what you do.
Okay. I'm a PhD student. My name's David Farouk. I work mostly in sports, so action perception in sports. But I found Damian and Madhur's work, and we kind of linked up and really all got close. So I've kind of have joined into that the multi-scale dynamics, multifractal analysis project. So we have a lot of ongoing discussions. And I've been really grateful to learn from them. So yeah, and then bringing that together with reading more recently about a lot of the biotensegrity work, and the way that from both sides there's been this shared desire to kind of connect those frameworks, right? So this is a little bit maybe farther afield, but there was a while where I read quite a lot actually of the history of sort of somatic psychology, if you will. Starting from, there's a guy, Wilhelm Reif, who was kind of a Freudian, who then said, well, I want to know more stuff about what's going on with the body. He also was really interested in how bodies responded or reacted, or even were situated, nested within these developmental and social scales, which I think was a really interesting project that he took in some very interesting directions and ended up, essentially devolving into a kook, unfortunately, kind of at the end. However, there was something interesting in that project. Other people, I don't know if you guys may be familiar with names like Alexander Lowen, took that in other directions, in terms of somatic psychology later on. So I was curious. So, because one of the things that strikes me, reading through that literature is a lot of times there's sort of a metaphor of storage in the body, very simplistic. And not whenever, but often when there's talk of neural components, it's usually just sort of something about the lizard brain. And I was just curious if there's anybody who's looking at the kind of these areas of somatic psychology using these more contemporary understandings of multifractal biotensegrity, and things like that.
David, did you say storage?
Well, I was just saying, when you read back, and some of it's partially just maybe the time period at which these authors were writing, but the physiology, understanding physiology, and a lot of the somatic psychology that I've read could do with a lot of updating. But at the same time, I'm interested in the questions that they're asking. And I just was wondering if anyone's asking those and bringing to bear these updated understandings on those questions.
The only thought I have when I hear you talk about storage, I think of Michael Levin's work, uh, where he takes the planaria and they teach the planaria how to, go here to find food, something. They teach it something. And then they cut it up into 20 different pieces. And even like the little tail piece, each of those pieces grows into a new planaria. And once those planaria have developed to the point where they have a brain, they have that information about where to go to find the food. So that memory, that storage seems to be not neurologically centered or not brain centered, okay, but perhaps has a more whole body substrate, the holism thing.
Yeah. What I was meaning with the storage was just sort of a tendency, particularly in the literature. Well, the central question being, particularly when organisms have very adverse or potentially traumatic experiences, they persist in the effects, right? So you can have something where the event ends, but then somehow there's a continuation of the responses to that event over very extended periods of time. So there's sometimes a temptation just to say, well, it's stored in the body, right? And there's, some kind of pop science cliches around that maybe. Yeah, what I was just thinking about is like, what does biotensegrity give us in terms of thinking about the longer timescales of development? So, situating the body as, this kind of structure, but also one that's developing and changing within certain pressures and, even sometimes extreme events. But generally, how do we think about this as shaping over longer timescales, and those timescales being situated within social and cultural, constraints as well?
I'm just reminded of something that Steve's been talking about a lot lately, that we're not so much structures as we are events. And so we are structured events. So we're not randomly structured events, right? And in terms of going back to the phrase earlier used here today, degrees of freedom, it's incalculable. The degrees of freedom are, I mean, if you've got a bunch of goop inside and, forget the subcellular level even for a moment, but at the cellular level, you've got goop moving around goop, and in greater and greater aggregations or synergies or constructs, or depending on that, changing every moment, it seems incalculable. So anybody else? Because Diane's got a question too.
Just one thing before, so I think, something I find myself wishing, and I don't know if I should wish it because I don't know how much of an issue it is in the literature and needs, but like for your stuff, David, like where you're working with sports, I've always felt that like when students ask me about like what about muscle memory, I just sort of like I have to like wait and pause and let the whole like tensegrity idea, like it's like just there's stuff about that. Well, we can talk, like ask me about that afterwards. Like, and I feel like that's a place where I don't know who cares or needs to pin down what the muscle memory is like in an academic sense, but like I feel like that's one place where it seems like there could be a point of contact. And if I haven't read the articles that make this connection in the biotensegrity stuff, I apologize, but that's just sort of that's a connection I've always imagined.
I always have these slides in my presentations, especially on this topic, of a developing embryo inside a womb, and the mother is actually doing acrobatics. And only a tensegrity model can actually explain a developing embryo turning into, a creature with bones and muscles, counter to gravity with all sorts of motion, at the millisecond level. And when you actually look at the, the angular torques acting, on different parts, and, and the momentum and changes in momentum while the mother is doing acrobatics is, the traditional models won't be able to explain. And an uninterrupted development, anti-gravity. And by simultaneously, I show the picture of a building being built, from the bottom to top, where beams and pillars have specific structural roles which are set in as soon as you put the concrete. So gravity determines, whether something would serve as a pillar or a beam. You cannot make a building, horizontally and put it vertically later on. So only tensegrity structure can allow, body to form, in all sorts of shapes, with the mother doing all sorts of activities.
Mhm. Yes.
All
Yes.
right, Diane, yeah, you can, thanks, David. I'm gonna
I,
turn off your spotlight and I'm gonna put on Diane's, because Diane, can you turn your camera on?
I'm trying to, but
Excellent.
it says this, my host is, we'll try again. We'll try again. There we go. Oops. There.
Okay.
Okay. That's, we can get rid of that. Okay. Thank you, both of you for your very interesting comments, and you're introducing us to, as a group, to ecological psychology. This issue of muscle memory and the mind and body working together. Done a lot of work with babies and watching babies grow, and that whole, of course, as Madhur states, this is beginning in the uterus. It begins at the very beginning, as soon as there are two cells. The movement is happening, and the body is remembering this all the way along. This is why when we get to the point where we have actually a baby we can put on the floor and give it a safe place to start to roll around and push around and all of that, they are setting up this basis for movement that is standing and functioning in the world. And it is the most exciting and wonderful thing to watch. And one of my colleagues who trained his now nearly professional soccer boys, from that beginning, teaching them Bartenia fundamentals as they're growing that first year, and recognizing that those things that the child is doing are carried right into that whole soccer process, and how exciting it is. And he has the parents who come to him and say, "Why can't my kid stop when he wants to and kick the ball?" Well, because for a lot of reasons. Well, the baby can't learn doing that in a stroller. Can't learn doing that when you are holding two hands and carrying it along, as if the support comes from the sky instead of the earth. So you've opened that whole door here of the business of helping a child build through movement, build its coordination, its organization, and its whole biotensegral self. So I'll just throw that in.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Susan, I have a question that I could
Yeah.
quickly point out before I have to leave. First of all, thank you so
Diane,
much.
thank you. I'm gonna take your spotlight away. And yeah, Chris, I know you've got to leave soon, so thanks. Go ahead.
I want to start by really expressing my gratitude and thank you. For me, this is really an introduction. So I apologize if my questions are kind of lower level, but I think there's lots of people in this audience that are probably thinking along the same lines as I am. And earlier you talked about, this question of how can we can repeat the same movement, have the same effect, I guess. And yet there can be different levels of control. And I am wondering if you can go into that more slowly. I had a question for myself that I wrote down underneath. Is this something about I can remember in the fabulous foot article about nearly decomposable and that sort of thing. Can you link the two for me, or even just go more slowly about this fundamental question and the ideas that you have that can explain it?
Madhur, did you want to start?
Okay, so basically, in sum, it is repeatability without repeatability, repetition without repetition, right? That's how you sum it. So the thing is, okay, I'll describe the degrees of freedom problem. If this, or at least my perception of it. So you have, so at the joint scale, at the level of the body, we have these joints, like we have 200 or so bones, and we have very few joints, which we look for, movements in mostly 3 degrees of freedom, okay, angular movements. But each of those joints is actually coordinated by multiple muscles, not just one muscle, right? And those muscles can be moved in multiple ways. Each of those muscles they comprise of multiple motor units of different sizes and different lengths, because muscle is more like a spindle. So when you look at the composition of the motor units, that itself is not uniformly distributed within any muscle. Each muscle fiber has, different amount of actin mass and, fibers. Muscles have motor innervations, which are finite in number, but at the same time, there are infinite number of combinations of how that motor units can fire. So there is no correspondence, one-to-one correspondence between what is happening in the brain in terms of neural activity to how much discharge actually goes to muscle activation. We still do not understand actually very well that if we record from high density EMG, how exactly the whole cluster of muscle is activated. What are the lags, what kind of effects happen within a cluster of muscles. And then you have this co-articulation at the muscle level, and then you have this joint. So when you look at the number of possibilities in which you can move a particular joint is infinitesimal. So what exactly would any control process, what is the control process trying to control? So you have models, Tinker toy models like UCM, for instance, which parse out the final variability at one particular scale into variability which affects performance or variability which does not affect performance at any scale, which is one way to look at it. There are other ways to look at it, which we use, for instance, with Damian, we look for variability and how that variability contributes to a final end performance. But that's basically the holy grail. Now it becomes more interesting when we talk about disease, for instance. One of the problems with, for instance, older people, as we age, our ability to Mark Latash has a series of beautiful papers that how motor degrees of freedom is actually a blessing and not a curse, right? We lose this blessing over time as we age, where we are not able to assemble these degrees of freedom flexibly, or we are not able to use the full space in which these exist. Same thing has happened in stroke. What we are losing in stroke a lot of times is our ability to have those degrees of freedom free of each other. They kind of get clustered together. So it gives a different perspective also on how we look at disease, or how we try to bring back, how we restore. So one way to think about treatment is not to restore the movement, but actually reintegrate and rewire the movement. So I think those are some of the implications of how we think about repetition without repetition from a degrees of freedom perspective.
So, if I can take a stab at it, is that I think on some of these interesting, so some of the evidence that psychologists have come up with that lend themselves towards tensegrity like explanations come from things like, if you take these fine motor abilities like speech, so if you are saying syllables, and then there's a perturbation to the way you can say the syllable. So that there was a participant in one of these studies who was wearing a bite bar that would sometimes unpredictably yank down on the jaw, and the speaker was actually able to complete the syllables despite the unanticipated, unpredictable, let's say, perturbations. And so the time in which they completed the syllable was actually faster than you could have electrochemical communication through the cranial nerves, even back to the brain. And so that was an example for us that like there were so some amount of control had been ceded to the articulators that was still within the sort of the whole like organism bag and sort of was part of that fluid system, but the control had been delegated to the articulator synergies to finish the job, even if there was not a chance to go back and check with the CEO in charge about whether this is a legitimate adjustment. So there are, in other words, all these adjustments that happen at a finer scale that are sooner up to context than they are up to the explicit stipulation of a control system internally. And so that's one way in which sort of the control can shift. So we have a movement system that relies on very coarse general intentions being sent out, and the body sort of lurches in that direction, and then it hands off the specific sort of direction of the peripheral degrees of freedom according to on the fly behaviors and the perturbations out in the context. Does it?
So ideally, we have many options or degrees of freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
And
yes.
when these constraints, which we may or may not be able to identify,
right.
bar under the tongue, but
right.
maybe it's a pebble that I'm walking on. If we have those degrees of freedom, there's just these adjustments that are not neurologically based, but they're they emerge because of the tensegral system.
So there is ample evidence now, for instance, kids raised with infants raised with diapers, especially the old kind of diapers, actually are not able to move their legs properly because of that, bulk between the legs, and have poor balance control and a lot of falls, and in general, different development than kids with diapers. And different kinds of diapers actually affect the whole development trajectories very differently.
I'm sorry, I have to go, but hearing this, it'd be interesting, I'm in Canada in the north where the children, I guess lots of cultures, the children were carried on your back for a long time. Others are able to, they're on the floor. It'd be interesting to compare and contrast, but I'm sorry, I must dash. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the conversation. I'll have to catch up on the YouTube replay.
Thanks,
Thank you, Chris.
I looked at the body as a movement, as a ready, get set that may be from the brain or a central control system, but the go is peripheral and body oriented rather than brain oriented. So you get the ready, get set, the mind or whatever gets the picture of what has to happen, and then it moves into the body. And that's peripherally and controlled, by small unit kind of things, conversation.
And so then there's that loop too, right? So
Yeah,
I've got the idea that I want to do something, is that cup reachable? Is that, whatever it is, and then the environmental feedback comes, and the system is constantly reconfiguring. This whole, and Bob, I see you've got a question. We talked a couple of weeks ago about injuries in baseball pitching. And one of my thoughts is that the idea of the body as a machine model, where you want to try to do the exact same thing every time, rather than you want to get a successful result every time, which is a different thing and needs to be understood as a different thing, is, to my mind, rooted into some of the stuff you guys are talking about, where you've got the many to one mapping going on, and different soft assembled synergies coming together moment to moment, so that the concept of a repetitive motion injury wouldn't even make sense.
So a lot of modern rehabilitation and a lot of modern training, any machines in gym basically are repetition with repetition and not repetition without repetitions. Uh, so and there's a this with these new tools like motion capture and these things more accessible. Now there are more and more emphasis in sports right now to get that angle correct while pitching, for instance, or different different kind of moves, and the focus remains on the repetition of that particular movement than the functional outcome. So you're right about that. With the last talk, it's happening because the tools have been becoming easier, and it's much easier to measure a joint angle, for instance, compared to measure a more functional outcome of the whole movement.
Great. Okay, we've got Bob Cohen's gonna come up. Hey, Bob.
Hey, thank you everyone for a wonderful conversation. I think I have somewhat of an uninformed question since this is a whole brand new concept for me that I'm probably 2 days into studying. So I have more. I am a manual physical therapist, so I treat a lot of people who have chronic illnesses. Let's say I have a patient who comes in who is having a problem with chronic headaches. Then I'll come in and find out that their cranial base is uneven, and I can maybe possibly discern that the cranial base is uneven because there's also other dysfunctions in the clavicles and the pelvis and the feet, and I can go through and, try to restore, the system and try to improve, kinematics, throughout. And we've had this conversation from a biotensegrity perspective, but I was wondering if you guys could comment on. It's like I said, I can get the body what I think is functioning normally, but when it comes down to instead of learning, the concept of relearning and memory, because now I got to get them to reestablish a better movement pattern from what they, let's say, have had for the past decade. So any thoughts about how I might be able to apply some of these principles into improving, I guess, the relearning of things once the body has restored normal mobility or has their, I guess, a greater degree of freedom than they had pre-injury or pre-treatment?
Madhur?
I'm not sure. I mean, so a lot of my thoughts on this are basically based on my algorithms and based on what I see on my screen than actually dealing with patients. We're trying to go into that direction, but I don't think I'm in the right position right now to comment on that.
Yeah, we regret we don't have the clinical fixes yet. What comes to mind though is sort of like as we think about relearning or learning, things we're interested in are sort of like how sports psych has sort of found ways to do what Susan and Stephen are talking about in terms of like externalizing the goal. So we've worked specifically with quiet eye training, which they've used in golf putting and also basketball free throw shooting, sort of like trying to get the people to think less about how they're moving their individual parts and trying to think about more like focus on the goal state. And so not knowing much about your patients, I don't know what the right goal states are, and it might not sound exactly like a quiet eye training to sort of make it work, but I think
Is that quiet eye?
Yes, quiet eye. And so it's an attempt, and it's sort of there's not a whole, it's effectively a request to get away from what Madhur was talking about thinking about aspiring towards this angle of a specific set of degrees of freedom and getting more towards thinking about like, what do you want people to think about how they're interacting with the world. And so it's kind of like, it's in a way, it's sort of thinking about sort of getting focus more on the externalization of that control that we're talking about and trying. So I don't know quite what physical therapy training and exercise would look like from this perspective, but I think it doesn't. I think we're not about to sort of like ask people to start to remember how they're holding their hands and then, you know, think about like make a perfect arc. Like we're trying to get away from that sort of thing. And I think an ongoing challenge for Madhur and me is to figure out how we, I mean, it's going to depend on what sort of activities need help, I think. And that's a big constraint here.
So
Madhur, did you?
Yeah, so I'll give an example. So, you know, you have this dual tasking in you know, in aging people with balance deficits in general. You know, dual tasking is recommended especially dual cognitive tasking, as one of the ways to improve balance. But what we are finding now in our data with older adults with network analysis on the whole body, which is basically some kind of tensegrity modeling, is that older adults have a very stiff overall body where they are not able to disconnect the lower and upper body compared to what younger people do. And so body is basically acting as a unit. So when you have a secondary task, that's what is causing a lot of falls. So one of my PhD students, he's actually he has 20 years of experience in rehabilitation. So now he's thinking of designing a task where it includes. So clinically, they have been using this cognitive dual task, and most of the dual tasks are cognitive, where you stand and you do a dual task. We have a dual task on wobble board, but he wants to do a movement dual task where upper body actually has to move and the lower body also has to move, but those are very two different tasks to be able to disconnect the two in terms of control. So I think this whole idea of nested and biotensegrity, you know, kind of leads to some of those you know, new ways to think about it. And I think we are at a stage where we are still generating data from healthy populations and trying to understand the phenomena before we have, first of all, grant to get access to that population, because working in clinical population is expensive. So once we have that, you know, we have plans to, you know, to see what we can do for rehabilitation and training.
So this is a little bit rubbing your belly and patting your head at the same time.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You're getting people to deliberately kind of do two different kinds of things.
So for instance, you know, standing on a balance board which
Yes.
has a mediolateral instability, and while you are doing that, you know, basically, you know, on a table you have this task where you have to, you know, take that loop through the metal wire, you know, very precisely so that it doesn't touch and light the bulb or a buzzer, right? So then you have a very sophisticated movement task on top of a gross movement task, but those are you're using lower and upper extremities compared to a purely cognitive, you know, task while standing.
It seems like we haven't really talked about the concept of affordances, but it seems like there's a link here to the concept of affordances, where if somebody doesn't feel like they're able to do something, you know, if they're injured, if, you know, whatever it is, it's restricting their range of affordances. Or am I using the term?
There's a ton of work in that, you know, with people with injuries or history of injuries, people with chronic ankle instability, fall, you know, hip problems. I mean, that literature doesn't use the word affordances, but you know what they do, you know, even their social interactions, and I mean, their whole life is very different based on that localized pain or localized fear, basically, of falling. You can call it affordances. I mean, we have not been using, or that particular academic discipline has not been using the term, but disconnected, yes.
But also, Madhur, what I'll find in some of my patients is that they'll have an area that they haven't been using appropriately, and you can reestablish the normal degrees of freedom, but they're still afraid to use that area. They're still afraid to try to move it in all the different degrees, because in the past it has hurt. Now they have the degrees of freedom to do that, but they're still unwilling. So, you know, those are things that we see in the clinic.
We just did hip replacement, total hip surgery for osteoarthritis. That what is happening is that counterintuitive to what we thought, that after surgery, it's their contralateral limb which has learned an adaptive, you know, behavior, which still persists even at 6 months after post surgery, which is actually not optimal. So they are having that cautious gait, you know, 6 months after post surgery, despite having a full range of motion of the hip. And that is actually leading to global coordination deficit. Yeah.
So in some sense, like it's not just what the person can do to maintain the rhythms or the exercise. I think it's also, I mean, I think if we want to talk about affordances, we get into sort of like what sort of built environment do they have to potentially scaffold the confidence back. That's sort of, so therapy can't just be about like, okay, do 10 lifts of this and 10 reps of this other thing. Like it's, you know, it's not just the body at all. So yeah. So yeah, but this is definitely where we want to grow into this kind of issue where we want to be able to provide some sort of insight. So,
I love the phrase, scaffold the confidence back. That's really good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Diane, you're coming back on again with another question. Go ahead. Let's see if I can.
I would just add to that. Sorry, I just lost it. I'm sorry. I lost it. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. We're pretty much almost out of time anyway. I wanted to just say one more thing while you guys are still here, because Damian, I know you've got a meeting to go to. First of all, I want to thank you both. I would like to hear a comment or two, or if you have a thought. When I look at the stuff that's coming out of ecological psychology, what I see is great critical thinking skills. I mean, just like admirable critical thinking skills. And I think that that's something, no matter what the field, we need to be working on. You may or may not have thoughts on that.
I think critical thinking is across the domain. So hardcore cognitive scientists who I would argue, I think they are very critical as well. I think that critical thinking is within the paradigm, you know. So I won't say that, you know, ecological psychology is especially critical, to be honest. In fact, I would say that it has to do a lot more work in terms of its paradigms, in terms of its ability to design experiments and understand nesting. It has not lived up to its potential, I would say. So yeah, I mean, yes, it is critical because we like it, but critical thinking is pretty common across good science. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for your time today. It's just been such a wonderful introduction to this new area that we who have been studying biotensegrity for a while are getting into. And so I'm just so grateful for you both to be here today. Madhur, you said you would give us a closing toast.
Okay, so thank you everyone for inviting us, and it's a pleasure to be. This is my third Zoom with Damian in life. So
and we met once too.
We met once too as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Professor Levin.
Steve, please.
And hope we'll reconnect as well, you know, for broader discussions when maybe do something together.
Love to join you guys.
L'chaim.
L'chaim.
Thank you for having us. This was very, very fun. We appreciate it very much. The questions are great, and we look forward to talking more.
All right. Thank you so much.
Been our delight.
See you all.